Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we took a look at creating our voting interactor tests, for which we created our voting interactor, which is responsible for creating votes and making sure that the vote hasn't been created before and making sure that the vote is being saved. And we took care of separating all that logic into its appropriate files. So in today's episode, what we're going to do is bring in the final piece of displaying all the information that we're writing to the database, right? So for this, we're going to go into our voting system.application tests and we're going to bring in our statistics interactor, right? So we're going to be getting statistics. It's going to be the statistics interactor. So let's go ahead and create a statistics interactor. And by the way, I found out that the name for the interactor is not Interactor, it's Interactor, Interactor, right? So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and rename all the other files that I have named incorrectly. So a way to do this is because some of them will be lowercase as well. I will grab Interactor, I'll press Ctrl-Shift-H, and this will bring up a little window where I can rename stuff. So I can paste in Interactor in here and just replace the E and look into the entire solution and replace all. Alright, so let's press this. Let's say yes, okay, and let's look at the damage done, right? So we'll close this as well. Let's open this, and it looks like the only thing that hasn't been renamed are the files. So let's go ahead and rename this file here. I'll say yes, okay. And we'll do the same thing in our application. It looks like this is the only file that hasn't been renamed. Okay, so that's taken care of. Let's go ahead back to our statistics interactor and let's go ahead and set up our first test. So let's bring in fact from xunit and let's create a public void displays poll statistics. Okay, so the sole purpose of this interactor is to display data. So it's going to be one big God test to essentially test that the data brought out is being called from correct places and is being displayed or rather put into the correct object. Okay, so for this we're going to need a voting poll. I remember us creating a voting poll before somewhere, so I'm just going to quickly look through the tests to try and find it. And it wasn't here. Let's go ahead and look in the database, voting system persistence, and there it is. So this poll, I'll just quickly grab it so I can reuse it and paste this here. Let's go ahead and bring in the namespace. Okay, so if you're adventurous, you can go ahead and try to write this test yourself. Remember, all we want is to have a voting poll returned from the iPersistence interface, which we're going to mock to return this. And then it's going to go through some functions like our counter manager to essentially end up with poll statistics and counter statistics in one object, right? Let's go ahead and get started. First thing, we will need our mock. So let's go into the voting interactor. I'll grab my persistence mock and I'll pop it here. Let's go ahead and import this, and we will need to import mockq as well. Let's go ahead and create our interactor. New, what are we gonna call it? Statistics interactor, right? And I actually called this as the test, so let's go ahead and rename this file interactor tests and rename this as well, and we'll take the tests off here. Okay, so we're gonna have this class. Let's go ahead and generate this class. So I'll rename it to public, and I'm gonna make sure that I'm passing my mock persistence object here, and I'm just gonna accept this in my constructor as the persistence parameter, and I'm gonna generate a field because I know I'll need it in the future. So what I want to receive by the end are poll statistics, right? So poll statistics, because people might want to either see them or vote on them. Well, we'll need to do some kind of identifier here, right? But we'll get to that in a second. So let's go to our interactor. Let's call get statistics of some kind of ID, right? So we're gonna generate a poll ID. Let's go ahead and create this, and we will need this method as well. So we're gonna generate this method. Let's make it public. And for now, it's okay that it will return an object. What we also want to do is for our mock persistence, let's set up to use a get poll, where we are going to pass poll ID with ID 1, right? And this is going to return or returns our poll that we have set up here. So obviously we don't have this function, so we will have to generate this method. Let's go ahead here and make sure that it has the correct return type. So once we have this, let's make sure that it returns spelled correctly. Okay, so this is going to return this poll essentially here. And first thing, just to kind of step in the door, all I want to do is I want to assert that the poll statistics are going to be equal, like the title and the description are going to be equal across the both. So let's go ahead and compare the title first of the poll statistics and the poll description. Oh, nope, description, kind of there, almost. Title, and description. Okay, so for now, what we can do is return a voting poll to make this compile. And let's go ahead and run only our application.test test. And let's actually zoom in on these ones here. Okay, so this one, this is the one that's failing, obviously because it's not implemented. So let's go ahead and return this particular poll here. So all we're gonna do is we're gonna say persistence, get poll, we're gonna supply poll ID here, and return this. Okay, so super simple to make this pass. So this is obviously not all, because what's going to happen is these counters are gonna have some sort of a count, and we want to end up with some counter statistics. So we have a counter manager in our voting system project, which essentially takes care of generating a percentage and resolving the excess of the percentage, right? We have to somehow bring this into here to reuse that logic, okay? And when we mock, we use an interface. At the moment, an interface is not something we have. So what I want to do is I want to create an interface for the counter manager and reuse those functions, okay? So what I will essentially want to happen is, let's say, I will separate my counters. So counter 1 will equal to this first counter. And let's say that the count will be 1. And I will grab a second counter. This is going to be 2. And let's increment the counter on the top one, right? The percentage itself, same as in some tests before, it doesn't really matter at this point. We want to just make sure that we supply these two counters. And for our not mock persistence, sorry, let's create a I counter manager. Mock counter manager. And let's put this here as well. Let's generate this interface. We can put this here for now. And what this will essentially do is, let's make this public. It will grab the counter here. So let's go ahead and at this point we can kind of mock it to this counter. We don't really have to, but we can kind of do it. And let's see how let's actually do this. We're not going to mock it to this particular counter manager, because when we were making the counter manager, we weren't accounting for the fact that it's going to be involved in the bigger system like this, okay? So what we're going to do here is we're going to work from top down and then adapt this solution to this interface, okay? So let's go ahead and say for our mock counter manager, so let's grab mock counter manager, and we're going to set up. So what we want to happen is that when we resolve the percentage, because that's what we're doing, percentage or percent, let's just call this percent. What we want to do is we want to resolve the percent of all the counters, okay? We don't have this function, so let's go ahead and generate this method. What I want this to return then is essentially my counter statistics with the percentage, right? So returns, and this should return a new list with the statistics. So let's go ahead and generate counter statistics, and make sure this compiles. Generate class. There it is. Let's make it public. And this should have the percentage on it. You might think, why are we generating the second one? I've mentioned this a couple of times before. What I don't want is storing the percentage in the database, because it can be generated every single time when we get this voting poll statistics, okay? It's accidental state, okay? So let's go ahead and rename this to double, just because I know that percent is going to be double. And what I will need is counter stats 1 and counter stats 2. And I will rename this accordingly. And I will botch the percentage a little bit, just because I want to, right? This is not the point of this test. The point of this test is to essentially make sure things are getting called in the correct order. So let's go ahead and assign this to a list. So var counter stats. And we will say that it is a new list of counter stats 1 and counter stats 2. Okay. And who's this there? Let's grab the stats, and this is what this is going to return. And to make this compile, we're going to need to make this interface return an I collection of counter statistics. Okay, so now what do we want to essentially check? We want to check that the voting poll statistics is going to contain our counter statistics. Okay, let's say var stats 1, where we're gonna extract the statistics from our poll statistics. Like, I mean, we can call it counters for now, because it doesn't really matter that much. And what I want to do is I want to grab the first one, and I know that that is going to be this first counter that I return here. And what I can do is I can compare the name and the percentage, etc. Okay, so let's go ahead, grab the equals part, and let's say that we are going to be comparing the name, we're going to be comparing the count, and we're going to be comparing the percent as well to counter stats 1, name, count, percent. Okay, so this doesn't compile. I've gone ahead and wrote this out, but what we should be doing is trying to fix this. And one thing, let's actually see what the error is. Cannot apply indexing to an expression of I collection counter. Okay, so what we can do is change this to a list, and hopefully this error will go away. And I want to make sure that I do the same for my second one. Okay, so let's grab that. Let's grab our counter stats 2, replace these 3, and replace, oh, these are stats 1, let's replace this with stats 2, and make sure that we grab the second one. Okay, so at this point we're going to be checking both of our counter statistics that are going to be returned from the mock counter manager. So let's go ahead and run this, make sure that this fails before we go in. So this has failed to build. Not entirely, it's probably because I'm running the whole test suite, but yep. So here it is, it's failing. And the particular failure is on the percentage bit. So notice that the voting poll that we're returning from here is the one that we're returning from this function. So what we ideally want is to have these counter statistics on this voting poll here, but voting poll doesn't have a list for counter statistics. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new type, and we'll call it poll statistics. And what we'll do is we will save this poll to a variable, and then we're going to return the new poll statistics right here on the end. Let's go ahead and generate this class. It is public. I'm going to put it above here, above counter statistics. And a couple of things I will need to make this compile is I will need the title, description. So let's go ahead and make those. I'm going to copy this name here. Let's go ahead and make a title, description. And now I want the counters. So let's go ahead and make a prop list and counter statistics. Okay, and I can call this counters as well. And now what I want to do here is I want to grab this poll's particular counter statistics. So first, let's assign the title. Let's get rid of the easy stuff first. And then we want the description. And now we want to assign the counters, and they will come from our resolve percent for all the counters, right? So this is where we will need to pass our mock into counter statistics statistics interactor. So let's go ahead and grab our mock counter manager and pass in the object here. Make sure that we change the constructor. So let's grab the interface here. Boom. Make the counter manager, generate the field, and let's grab the statistics. Statistics equals counter manager, resolve percent, poll.counters. Okay, and now we can get the statistics here. And resolve percent doesn't actually really sound to me right now because we're getting statistics of the counters. So let's go ahead and rename this to get statistics. Okay, so Control R twice, and that will rename the method here, here, and anywhere else that is used. Okay, so let's take a look at what it's erroring here. It can't convert iCollection to a list, so what we can do is convert this to a list, and this should be alright. Let's go ahead and put a semicolon here, make sure this compiles, and let's run this. Okay, so it looks like we have an error here that this returns counter stats. Let's go ahead and convert this to a new list of counter statistics. Can't see the type that I was selecting. Okay, now this should compile. Let's go ahead and run this. And all the tests are passing. Another thing that we are forgetting, or rather missing at this point, is the resolution of the excess. So what we want to do by the end of this is make sure that the excess was resolved. So let's grab our counter manager, and here we are going to set up that resolve excess has been called with our counter statistics, because remember that this is the particular thing that we want to resolve the excess on. This is where the percentage exists. The percentage does not exist on the counters here, right? So, and this, not setup. We want to verify that this has been called, and let's generate this method. So resolve statistics, list counter statistics. Yep. And let's make sure that this is only called once. Okay. So we can run this. No, this is going to fail because we're never calling this function. Okay, and now what we want to do is we essentially want to call this, right? So let's go ahead and grab not persistence. We want to grab our counter manager, and we want to resolve excess, and we want to call it on statistics. At this point, let's go ahead and run the test, and it should pass. Okay. So running through this mentally, we are grabbing a poll, we are then retrieving the statistics for the counters, and we're resolving the excess. And then we are essentially giving back the cumulative result. So what do we want to do now? Let's go ahead and run all the tests and see where it doesn't compile, okay? So the first place that it doesn't compile is the fact that we're not implementing the function of getting the voting poll, okay? So what we need to do is write a test for this. So let's go to our voting system.database layer, database.tests, and go into voting system persistence tests. And let's go ahead and write a test for right here, maybe? No, let's go to the bottom. But what I'll do is I'll actually grab this poll, and let's go ahead and put public void. I will paste the poll here so I can copy it in a second, and I just want to grab the name of get poll, and we'll say get poll returns saved poll with counters, and this will be it for now. Let's go ahead and put this poll right here. We'll grab the transactions at the top here as well. Let's go ahead and take them. We'll put them at the bottom here. We don't want to do this. We want to grab our context, and we want to go to voting polls, and we want to add our poll, and then we want to save changes. So save changes right here. Then we want to grab our saved poll. So let's go ahead and grab our system persistence. We don't need to save it into an object. We can just grab the get poll function, and we're gonna supply 1 here because this is the only thing that's gonna be saved in here. And let's assign it to the saved poll over here, and we'll remove this bit. So at this point, this is what this test looks like. Let's see if it's failing. We'll run everything just to make sure that everything compiles as well. Okay, so it looks like it's failing, and I'm getting a feeling it's because of the name. So let's go ahead and grab the get poll and put it here, and let's run everything again. Could have just run these tests. Okay, so this is the only thing that fails, and it throws because we haven't actually implemented this function. So let's go ahead to our get poll, and let's implement this. So what do we need to check? We need to check the name, and we need to check the title, description, and the counters, right? So let's go ahead, return context, and we'll grab the voting polls, where we want to include all our counters. Right, so x.counters using entity framework, and it looks like we have counters on here. We do have the counters property, so that was chill. Let's say to list, or no, we are meant to be grabbing the specific poll. So let's make sure that we can use ef property. So again, when I explained how entity framework works, this is where we're going to be grabbing the ID property from our object, and we're going to make sure that we compare it to poll ID here. And by the way, again, you don't have to do these if you don't want to. If you want to go ahead and include the ID here, you can do that, and it's probably wise to do that. So basically, in Statistics Interactor, when we return the poll statistics tests here, what I essentially mention is that once we display the poll, we maybe want to display the AD or not, depending on how we are going to think our voting is going to work. Okay, so shouldn't really have closed that, but I'm going to keep it as is, and until I'm going to run into problems with not having the ID property, I'm going to leave it like this. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so this looks like it's passing. Let's go ahead and kick this up a notch. What we're going to do is for our get poll function, instead of returns saved poll with counters, we will add and votes as count. Alright, so the votes that have been voted, those are going to be the count of the counter. Alright. So again, we're not going to be storing the counter in the database. This is something that we're going to be retrieving from the database, and again, it's accidental state here. All right, so let's go ahead and add a few votes. Let's go ahead into our context here, and let's go into votes, and we will add a new vote, and specifically we want user ID, let's say A, and counter ID, we'll say 1. Let's create 3 of them. Counter ID will stay 1 here and 2 here. B, C. A and B are voting for counter number 1 as it's going to get saved, and the user C is going to be voting for counter number 2, right? So we have 3 votes here. And essentially what I'm expecting is for counter 1 to end up with count 2, and counter 2 end up with count 1, okay? So let's go ahead and change this test a little bit, and it's going to start looking a little bit like our Statistics Interactor test. So what we can do is we can actually grab this bit here and move into here, and because we're only testing it for these two, let's move them here, and let's grab the counter 1. We'll change it here. We'll replace this with poll, and this should give us our first counter, so we can replace everything here. Name, we can say that it's 1. Let's go ahead and say 1 here. Count is going to be 2. Let's remove the percentage because we don't have it at this point. And we can do the same for our counter 2. So let's grab our counter 2 here. We'll get it from the poll and count. Oh, this is actually 2, not 2 as in the thing. Yeah, you get. Let's put the counter 2 here, 1 and 1 here, and we'll remove assert. Okay, simplify let's say document, and this should remove all of these. Okay, nice. Alright, so hopefully this makes sense. First, we verify that we have the correct amount of counters returned, and we verify the title with the description. Next thing is we get each of these counters individually, and we make sure that the count on them is appropriate regarding with IDs that it's going to be adding on them, right? So we know how Entity Framework works. We're kind of expecting, right? We're going to add this. ID 1 is going to assign to it. We can even go ahead and add the property here to even more solidify our test, right? So we can go ahead and say something like ID here and assign our ID here as well. But I'm not going to do that just yet because I think that's a little bit on the Entity Framework's part to require that ID. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. Obviously, this is going to fail, right? So if it's not obvious, now it is. Okay, so what we want to do is assign the amount of votes that we have to this counters count. Okay, so let's go ahead and first think about how we can retrieve. If we go to the counter class, we don't have a navigational property to the votes, right? So we don't exactly know how many votes this is, and we don't want to do 2 queries. Okay, so we don't want to call ctx and into votes and do where x.x for every counter, where we're going to provide x and grab the counter's ID. Is going to be a mess, right? So we need the navigational property. So this is where we're going to use our Entity Framework and knowledge to essentially achieve that. So first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and make a select statement, where in here we're going to create a new voting poll, just like that. And this is going to seem a little bit redundant, and unfortunately these kind of things sometimes happen. So we have the title, we will also pass the description, and then we have the counters. So the counters, this is where we're going to go into our voting poll, and we're going to select these counters. And this is again where we can select. Now this time we're going to put Y. Again, if you feel like you need to essentially do something like poll and counter, feel free to do that. I am comfortable with having X's and Y's. So let's select a new counter. And this is where we are going to pass the name of y.name. And for the count, we're going to select y votes.count. Okay, so this is going to be a list of votes, which we are going to create now. So let's go ahead and create a let's create a list of vote and grab our list. We can call this iCollection. So start with this smallest implementation kind of thing. So IEnumerable, iCollection, a list. So the more features you need, you kind of go up in implementation. But IEnumerable, we know that we are not going to get navigational property in Entity Framework with IEnumerable, so we opt in for iCollection first. And let's say votes. Okay, so let's close that. And the count, I don't think we'll need to grab that. And to get rid of this error, what we'll need to do is call toList here. Okay, so what Entity Framework will do with this is it will create an efficient SQL query. It will not go through every row and count them. SQL is still like somebody wrote code for that program, and it's just keeping counters on disk and stuff like that, and indexes of where memory is efficiently. Okay, so I'm not gonna go delve into that. Let's go ahead and run our test. Let's see what's happening. Okay, so we have an invalid operation exception. Let's see what's happening. If property called with wrong property name. So this seems like a weird error, but essentially it makes sense because when we select the query here, we don't actually have the ID on this new property. So what we'll have to do is, unfortunately, let's move this up here and replace this with where. And then at the end, let's go ahead and call our first or default like this. And let's go ahead and put a semicolon here, and let's run this. So this crashes. It looks like the expected count is 2 and the actual count is 0. So let's go ahead and check out why this is happening. And at first sight, I can see that we are grabbing the counter one from Paul. So what we want to do is grab our saved Paul and replace this here. So we're fixing our test. Let's go ahead and run this test again. Okay, and the second failure is again around our test. The second counter should actually have 2 in its name. Let's go ahead and run this again. Okay, and the test is passing. So we're essentially grabbing the voting poll title description counter, and we are assigning the count to the votes. And one thing, as I said before, the count is not going to be stored in the database. This is something that we derived from the amount of votes. So what we can do is we can go in our app.db context, and in our model builder here, let's go ahead into our entity, onto our counter, and we will grab the ignore property, and we will say ignore the count. Okay, so what this is going to do is this will no longer store the property count in the database. So when we're going to create our tables, it's not going to create the column name count. Okay, so once that's done, let's go ahead and run all our tests. So at this point, everything is working. One thing is we need to create an implementation for our, let's close everything, for our post, what's it called? Not poll statistics, but rather iCounter Manager, right? So as we said, the iCounter Manager is meant to be for the counter manager. So let's go ahead and move these classes into their respective files and fix up the iCounter Manager. So let's go ahead and move the poll statistics, the counter, the iCounter Manager, and the statistics interactor. Nice. So I will grab poll statistics, iCounter Manager, and counter statistics, Control X to cut them, and paste them into the voting system. We can create a folder called view models as well, but let's hold out on that for a second. So we'll go into counter statistics, and we will fix up the namespace. On poll statistics, we'll fix up the namespace as well. For our iCounter Manager, we'll fix up the namespace as well. Okay, so now that that's ready, let's go ahead and make sure that statistics Interactor tests are still intact. Nice. So after the move, everything is fine. Let's go ahead and move our statistics Interactor into the application layer. Fix up the namespace as always. So now the big move. Let's go ahead and open our Counter Manager and iCounter Manager. And what we'll do is we will change the implementation to iCounter Manager here, okay? And this is going to break a few things. Let's go ahead and implement these interfaces. We will now take the get statistics and let's put it at the top here. And let's go ahead and return new counter statistics, or rather counters dot select. And this is where we're going to select our new counter statistics, where we can assign the name. And by the way, if you're confused which part of test-driven development this is the refactoring part. Okay, so this is the part where we're going to create an implementation for the counter manager, since this is already has tests, and we are going to fuse the two together and kind of expect to fix tests for these. Okay, so let's grab the name. Let's also grab the count. And for the percent, we're going to grab this roundup here and put this here. One thing we're not going to have is the total count. So let's go ahead and replace with this with x.count. This thingy is not meant to be here. We can delete this part. And for total count, this is something that we'll need to extract. Let's remove the semicolon. And let's grab the total count from counters.count, and let's sum this up. Oh, this is a function, or okay, I called it at the wrong place, so here is where I want to call count on here. Okay, so I'm gonna sum up all the counts, I'm gonna get the total count, and I'm gonna return this here. And I've deleted one too many brackets, so I will need to add this bracket and put a semicolon. So that takes care of that. Obviously, that is going to break some tests. We are going to fix that in a second. And it looks like I'm actually missing a bracket as well. So let's go ahead and put a bracket here. And this actually has to be a list as well. So I'm getting a little bit too ahead of myself, but there we go. And actually, the list looks okay here. So next thing is the resolve excess. Let's go ahead, grab this and put this up here. And these look pretty much the same, so what I'm gonna do is I'll just say let's grab the type of counter statistics and paste it here. And yep, to my expectation, nothing broke. Okay, so minimal damages, that's very nice. Let's go ahead and run our tests and see how much of our tests will suffer. So something breaks. Let's go ahead into our error list, and what, 10 errors. Okay, not a big problem. Most of them seem to be around us passing the wrong amount of parameters, and one of these is, we essentially need a list. So let's go ahead and convert this to a list. So just like that, and we'll delete the total count. Okay, and here, because we are going to be returning a lot of them, let's grab the first. Will we need link for this? Yes, we do. Can't believe we didn't have link in this file before. But yeah, there it is. Let's go ahead and do this again. So I believe we can just grab this whole thing, paste this here, and let's see where else we can do this. So total count here as well. This will have to change. Paste this here. Resolve excess. This will need to be counter statistics. So let's call this counter statistics. Will this need to be a list? This will need to be a list. Let's go ahead and change the types here. Okay. Next thing, again, same thing with the types. Let's go ahead and change the types. Same thing here. And by the way, if you're wondering how I'm doing this select here, what you can do, you can have your cursor either on the end, Control Shift back when you're on the end, and then Shift Alt up, and that will select these two, and then Control V to paste. What you can also do if you're in the middle of the word, if you don't want to jump to the end, you can press Control W and Shift Alt up, and then Control V. Okay, and that's basically how I'm doing this. So paste here, not that many times. Same thing here. Okay, so compilation errors are gone. Let's go ahead and run our tests. I'm expecting quite a few failures. Okay, so let's look at the damage. It looks like we only have one test failing, and that is the get statistics shows percentage up to 2 decimal places based on total count. So this is where we have a count that we set and a total that we no longer use. So what I'm going to say is let's go ahead and switch back to the English language, and we will create a counter, which will be a new counter, where for the count, we can go ahead and set it to total minus count. Okay, so this way we will essentially have the excess of the count, and we will end up with the total. Okay, so total of 10 minus 5, 5 plus 5, we will end up with 10, right? So we'll pass the counter here. Let's go ahead and rerun this test. And here we are. So let's go ahead and run all of this again. Everything lights up green. We're in the promised land. Hooray. Give yourself a high five, alright? You deserve it. So in this episode, we essentially went ahead and linked up the retrieval of data from this interactor. So we're essentially grabbing stuff from the database and then putting it through our business logic via the iCounter manager interface, and then we're returning it, which is then going to be hooked up into our web application. All right. So this is going to be it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments. Don't forget to join the Discord server, And as always, I'll see you in the next episode.